History often tells us that nations are built by brave speeches, signed documents, and victorious wars. But it rarely tells us how close those nations came to disappearing before they were ever fully born. In the early years of the United States, there existed a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the country nearly collapsed under the weight of betrayal, ambition, and fear. No foreign army invaded. No cannon fired the first warning shot. The danger came from inside. Men who wore the same uniforms, spoke the same language, and claimed loyalty to the same flag. This is the true story of a forgotten American crisis, one so shocking that if it had succeeded, the United States as we know it would never have existed. In 1783, the American Revolutionary War officially ended. On paper, the United States was free. In reality, it was exhausted, broke, divided, and dangerously unstable. The war had drained everything. Soldiers had gone months, sometimes years, without pay. Farmers had lost land. Merchants were drowning in debt. The Continental Congress, the supposed government of the new nation, had almost no power to tax or enforce laws. It could make promises, but it could not keep them. George Washington understood this better than anyone. He had won the war not with abundance, but with patience, holding together an army that often lacked food, boots, ammunition, or hope. His soldiers respected him not because he paid them well, but because he suffered alongside them. Yet by the winter of 1782 to 1783, even Washington sensed something dark growing beneath the surface. The war was ending, independence was secured, but the men who had fought it were being forgotten. The Continental Army was encamped near Newburgh, New York, along the Hudson River. It was a cold, bitter winter. Many soldiers were barefoot, their coats were thin. Their pay, long promised by Congress, had still not arrived. Congress had made commitments, full back pay, lifetime pensions for officers, compensation for years of service. But the Articles of Confederation had created a weak central government. Congress could ask states for money, but it could not force them to pay. States argued, debts piled up, soldiers waited. Frustration turned into anger. Anger turned into resentment. Resentment turned into something far more dangerous. Rumors began spreading through the camps, quiet conversations in the dark, whispered around campfires. What if Congress never pays us? What if they disband the army and forget us? What if we take what we are owed? Some officers began to believe that the only way to force Congress to act was through pressure, military pressure. A nation barely born was now facing a terrifying possibility, its own army turning against civilian government. Among the officers at Newburgh was a man named Major John Armstrong, Jr. Armstrong was intelligent, articulate, and deeply angry. Like many others, he felt betrayed by Congress. He believed the politicians were happy to praise the Army's sacrifices so long as they didn't have to pay for them. In March 1783, an anonymous letter began circulating through the camp. It was written with fire. The letter accused Congress of ingratitude and cowardice. It suggested that the Army had power and should use it. It hinted that the soldiers might refuse to disband. It even suggested that force might be the only language Congress understood. The letter called for a secret meeting of officers. No name was signed, but many suspected Armstrong. This was not a protest, this was a conspiracy. The ideas discussed were radical, unthinkable for a republic that had just escaped monarchy. Some officers proposed that the Army should march on Congress. Others suggested refusing to lay down arms until demands were met. A few went even further. What if the Army installed a strong leader to stabilize the nation? What if the United States needed a king? The irony was cruel. The same army that had fought to overthrow tyranny was now flirting with becoming one.
This moment, later known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, was one of the most dangerous in American history. It was not a riot, it was not chaos, it was calm, calculated, and frighteningly rational, and it nearly succeeded. George Washington learned of the anonymous letters almost immediately. Many expected him to sympathize. After all, he too was owed money. He too had watched Congress fail. He too was frustrated. But Washington understood something that others did not. If the Army challenged civilian authority even once, the American experiment would die before it truly began. He decided to confront the situation directly. Washington announced that he would attend the officers' meeting himself. The room was tense. The officers were hardened men, veterans of years of war. Many believed Washington would support their cause. Instead, he did something unexpected. Washington stood before the officers, calm but visibly emotional. He spoke of the war, of sacrifice, of shared suffering. He warned them gently but firmly against destroying everything they had fought for. Then, near the end of his address, something extraordinary happened. Washington reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of spectacles. Few had ever seen him wear them. As he put them on, he paused and said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The room fell silent. In that moment, the anger dissolved. The conspiracy collapsed. Men who had been prepared to threaten Congress now wept openly. The meeting ended without violence. The Army stood down. The United States survived. Most Americans never learn about the Newburgh Conspiracy. It does not fit neatly into a heroic narrative, but it was proof that the greatest threat to the United States was never just foreign enemies, it was internal collapse. Washington's refusal to seize power became one of the most important acts in world history. He could have become a king. Instead, he chose restraint. That choice set a precedent that would define American democracy. But the danger did not disappear. In fact, it was only beginning.
The Newburgh Conspiracy ended quietly, but its silence was deceptive. Nothing had truly been solved. The Army dispersed. The war officially ended. George Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, an act that stunned the world. Kings across Europe could not understand it. Victorious generals did not walk away from power, not voluntarily. To many Americans, Washington's resignation felt like the closing chapter of the Revolution. In reality, it was only the end of the beginning. Because once the Army was gone, the United States faced a different enemy, one far more subtle and far more dangerous, its own design. The Articles of Confederation had been written during wartime, when fear of centralized power overshadowed every other concern. Americans had just escaped the British crown. The idea of another strong authority terrified them. So they built a government that could not command, could not tax, could not enforce. Congress could declare war, but not pay soldiers. It could sign treaties, but not enforce them. It could ask states for money, but could not compel them. Each state behaved like a small, jealous nation. Virginia argued with Maryland. New York taxed goods from New Jersey. Massachusetts struggled to control its own rural population. The Revolutionary War had united them against a common enemy. Peace removed that glue. By the mid-1780s, the United States was technically independent and practically ungovernable. Foreign powers noticed. Britain had lost the war, but not its interest. British troops still occupied forts in the Northwest Territory, openly violating the peace treaty. They believed, correctly, that the United States was too weak to force them out. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, strangling Western farmers who depended on it to move goods. France, once America's ally, grew impatient as debts went unpaid. European newspapers mocked the American experiment. A republic without authority, they said, was a contradiction. Liberty without order was chaos. Inside America, the mocking felt closer to prophecy. War had left the country buried under debt, national debt, state debt, private debt. Farmers had borrowed money to survive wartime shortages. When peace returned, prices collapsed. Courts began seizing land. Families that had fought for independence now faced eviction. No place felt this pressure more than Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a strong government, but it was rigid and unforgiving. Taxes were high, courts were aggressive, paper money was restricted, making debts harder to pay. In the western counties, anger boiled, and then it exploded. Daniel Shays was not a radical. He was not an intellectual. He was a farmer and a former Continental Army captain. He had fought for independence. He had bled for it. Now, like many others, he faced prison for unpaid debts. In 1786, armed farmers began closing courts to prevent foreclosures. They believed the revolution had promised them justice, not financial ruin. The rebellion grew. Men marched with muskets and drums. They wore old army coats. They flew flags that echoed revolutionary slogans. To the elites in Boston, this looked terrifying. Was this liberty or mob rule? The Massachusetts government called out the militia, but many militiamen sympathized with the rebels. Some refused to act. Eventually, a privately funded army put down the uprising. Shays' rebellion failed, but its message was deafening. George Washington watched events from Mount Vernon with growing alarm. He had hoped to retire quietly. Instead, letters poured in from across the country. James Madison warned him that the Confederation was tottering on the brink. Alexander Hamilton wrote that the government was imbecilic. Thomas Jefferson, in France, famously suggested that a little rebellion was healthy, but even he admitted the system was fragile. Washington feared something worse than rebellion. He feared disintegration. If states could not manage unrest, if Congress could not respond, if debts could not be paid, then what exactly held the United States together? The answer, increasingly, was nothing. In May 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, many knew revision would not be enough. They met behind closed doors, windows shut, guards posted. What happened inside was revolutionary. They did not fix the articles, they abandoned them. What they began writing was not a patch, it was a replacement. A new framework, a stronger central government, a system powerful enough to survive. But power frightened Americans, and the men in that room knew it. The Constitutional Convention was not harmonious. It was tense, bitter, divided. Large states fought small states. Slave states fought free states. Federalists fought anti-federalists. Every compromise came at a cost. Representation was split between population and equality. Slavery was acknowledged without being named. Power was divided, checked, and restrained. The Constitution was not perfect. It was necessary. When the final document was signed, it was sent to the states for ratification, and that was when the real fight began. Ratification was brutal. Newspapers exploded with essays, pamphlets, attacks. Opponents warned that the Constitution created a new tyranny. Supporters argued it was the only alternative to collapse. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote under a single name, Publius. Their essays, the Federalist Papers, became one of the most important political arguments ever written. But persuasion was not guaranteed. Several states nearly rejected the Constitution. Virginia hesitated. New York wavered. Rhode Island resisted entirely. The margin between success and failure was razor thin. Once again,
the United States stood at the edge. Reluctantly, George Washington was drawn back. His presence lent legitimacy. His silence would have spoken volumes. When the Constitution was finally ratified, it did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile. A grand experiment, balanced on trust. Washington was unanimously elected the first president. He did not celebrate. He worried. Washington's presidency stabilized the nation, but tensions remained. Political parties formed almost immediately, despite warnings against them. Economic systems divided the country. Foreign alliances pulled at loyalties. Regional identities hardened. The dangers that had nearly destroyed the nation before were still there, just quieter. History would remember the founding as inevitable. It was not. It survived because again and again, individuals chose restraint over ambition. But that restraint would not last forever.
By the time George Washington completed his presidency, the United States had survived its most fragile childhood years. But survival did not mean unity. Underneath the surface, the country was already splitting, philosophically, economically, and emotionally. Two visions of America were forming, and they were fundamentally incompatible. One believed in a strong federal government, centralized finance, industrial growth, and international respect. The other believed in states' rights, agrarian independence, and fear of centralized power. At the center of this collision stood two men who had once fought for the same cause: Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. Their rivalry did not remain intellectual for long. It became personal, it became vicious, and eventually it became dangerous. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, moved fast and aggressively. He believed the nation needed credit, banks, and federal authority. He wanted the United States to be taken seriously by the world. Jefferson saw something else. To him, Hamilton's system looked eerily familiar, too close to the British model they had just escaped: central banks, elite control, permanent debt. Washington tried to balance them. He failed. Political factions hardened into America's first political parties, despite Washington's warnings in his farewell address. Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, urban versus rural, North versus South. The United States had avoided military collapse, but ideological war had begun. And then came the moment that shocked the nation. Aaron Burr was brilliant, charming, and deeply ambitious. He had served in the Revolutionary War. He had political skill. He had no fixed ideology, only a hunger for advancement. Burr lost the presidential election of 1800. Then he lost the vice presidency in spirit, becoming isolated and distrusted. Hamilton despised him, publicly, repeatedly. In 1804, the two men met on the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton fell. The man who had built America's financial system was dead, killed by the sitting Vice President of the United States. The shock was profound, but the real danger was still ahead. After Hamilton's death, Aaron Burr did not fade away. He disappeared west. What he did there remains one of the most controversial and disturbing episodes in American history. Burr began meeting with military officers, land speculators, foreign diplomats. Whispers followed him. Some said he planned to carve out an independent nation in the Western Territories. Others believed he intended to invade Spanish lands and crown himself ruler. A few suspected something even worse, that he wanted to split the United States apart. The problem was not just Burr's ambition. The problem was that the West was restless. Settlers felt ignored by the Eastern government. Communication was slow. Loyalty was thin. If a charismatic leader promised power, protection, and prosperity, many were willing to listen. Aaron Burr understood that perfectly. Thomas Jefferson was now president.
He received intelligence reports, fragmented, contradictory, alarming. Was Burr guilty of treason, or was he merely reckless? Jefferson feared overreaction. The young republic could not afford to criminalize political opposition. But he feared inaction more. If Burr succeeded, the Union might fracture permanently. Jefferson ordered Burr's arrest. The former vice president was charged with treason, the highest crime under the Constitution. The nation held its breath. The trial of Aaron Burr took place in 1807, presided over by Chief Justice Marshall. The Constitution defined treason narrowly, deliberately so, only acts of war against the United States, supported by overt action. Burr plotted, he schemed, but had he acted? The prosecution struggled. Evidence was circumstantial, witnesses were unreliable, political motives clouded everything. In the end, Burr was acquitted, legally innocent, historically condemned. The verdict exposed a terrifying truth. The Constitution protected liberty, but it also limited the government's ability to stop internal threats. The Union had survived again. Barely. Aaron Burr lived the rest of his life disgraced, wandering, forgotten. But the idea he embodied did not disappear. The idea that America could split, that regions could break away, that ambition could outweigh loyalty. Those ideas moved underground. They waited. As decades passed, the nation expanded westward. Territory grew, so did tension. Slavery, avoided at the founding, returned as the central moral crisis. Compromises postponed conflict, but never resolved it. Every generation believed it had avoided disaster. Every generation was wrong. Because the United States had been living with an unresolved contradiction since its birth: liberty versus unity, power versus freedom. The early crises, the Newburgh Conspiracy, Shays' Rebellion, Burr's treason, were warnings. They were ignored, and eventually the warning became reality. The United States did not emerge strong because it was destined to succeed. It survived because it repeatedly came close to destroying itself and stepped back at the last moment. History remembers victories. It forgets near failures. But near failures shape nations more than triumphs ever could.